Tonight, we open a door most people would rather leave shut. A door hidden deep within the walls of the Vatican, behind locks no tourist ever sees, and prayers no one teaches aloud. It leads to a chamber without windows, where the church's most unsettling work takes place. No headlines, no applause, just one man, a book of rites, and a voice steady enough to speak when even faith trembles. He was known simply as the Chief Exorcist, a priest among priests, chosen not for his rank, but for his resolve. He didn't wear armor. He wore a stole soaked in holy oil, and a memory trained to recognize every whisper that didn't belong in a human voice. Over the course of decades, he performed more than 100,000 exorcisms, not a legend, not a myth, a count. A record so massive the Vatican never spoke of it publicly, and he never celebrated it, because to him it wasn't a number, it was a weight. But who was he really? A holy warrior? A relic of an old world? Or something else entirely? Something even the church struggles to understand? An archivist of the invisible war? His weapons were ancient prayers and flickers of Latin that once shattered silence like thunder. His battlefield was the mind, the soul, the forgotten spaces between medicine and miracle. And his enemies? They had no bodies, only names that history chose not to remember. They say he kept no mirrors near his chapel, that some rites were conducted in locked rooms with no witnesses but one, that Rome's emergency line rang differently when he was needed, and when he answered, he never asked for details. He already knew. He believed that evil wasn't always loud. It could be patient, quiet, even polite. It slipped through cracks in reason and settled into people like dust. And when it took hold, it didn't roar. It whispered. And if you weren't careful, it spoke in your own voice. Records exist, but just barely. Redacted case notes, audio reels with missing minutes, a ledger room in the Vatican where one page is missing, its absence darker than any ink. Even the archives seem afraid to remember everything, and maybe they should be, because if his count is true, if one man really did face darkness 100,000 times, then the question isn't how he did it, it's why he was ever needed at all. So before you get too comfortable, take a breath, because this isn't just a story about demons. It's about what happens when belief becomes a duty, and when that duty means carrying the weight no one else wants to hold. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's a confession wrapped in mystery, sealed with ritual, and buried in a silence deeper than most churches dare admit. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of the man who walked into rooms where no one else would go. And we ask, what did he see that made even Rome afraid to speak his name too loudly? They say some wars are fought in silence, not on battlefields, but in rooms where the air turns cold and the candles flicker against walls that should not move. In those places, prayers become weapons, and the human voice becomes the only thing standing between light and something that remembers what came before light. The man who walks into those rooms is not famous, not royal, not a saint. He is a priest, carrying nothing more than a book, a cross, and faith that has cracked but never broken. His name is whispered in corridors, not shouted in sermons. They call him the Chief Exorcist of the Vatican, and according to his own words, he has faced the unthinkable more than 100,000 times. Imagine spending your life staring into the eyes of something that hates everything human, every day, every year, for decades. He said it started small, one house, one family, one voice that didn't sound right in the dark. But soon, it became his calling. The church sent him across cities and continents, through villages that looked peaceful in the sun but screamed when the sun went down. Every possession, every whisper, left a mark on him. He said evil didn't show itself like in the movies. It wasn't heads turning or voices roaring. It was quiet, patient. It sounded like truth, like guilt, like something you thought only you could hear. He said that is how it gets in, not through magic, but through the cracks in people's faith. In one of his rare interviews, he said something that still chills those who heard it. "The devil is not afraid of holy water," he said. "He's afraid of those who still believe it works." When asked how he could perform over 100,000 exorcisms, he smiled the way someone does when numbers mean nothing, because to him, each one was a life. A story. A person whose name he would never tell. He described seeing shadows crawl where shadows shouldn't be, people speaking languages they had never heard, eyes that looked ancient even in young faces. But what frightened him most wasn't what came out of people. It was what tried to stay. He said, "Evil doesn't leave when you command it. It leaves when you stop giving it a home." The Vatican often kept his work quiet. They said it was to protect privacy, but some believe it was to protect belief itself, because if the world ever saw what he saw, faith might crack faster than stone. Inside those secret rooms, the air would grow thick, the prayers louder, and time would stretch until you forgot if you were praying for them or for yourself. He carried on anyway, day after day, because he said quitting meant surrendering the field. When someone once asked him if he still feared the devil after all these years, he paused and looked away. "No," he said softly, "but I fear what happens when people stop believing he's real. Rome at dusk doesn't look dangerous. The sky burns gold over domes and fountains, and tourists crowd the squares taking pictures of eternity. But when the light starts to fall, the city changes. The air smells of incense from evening mass, mixed with the sharp scent of diesel drifting up from the narrow streets. Bells echo from ancient churches, and pigeons scatter like dark secrets leaving their perch. Beneath all that beauty, there are places that never see the sun, tunnels and catacombs where bones have rested for centuries and where silence has a heartbeat. That's where he walks. He moves quietly, his black coat blending into the stones, a small leather case in his hand, the same one he's carried for decades. Inside are the tools of his trade, a silver cross, holy water, and the Book of Rites. He doesn't look extraordinary, just another priest among thousands, but the eyes that pass him don't meet his for long. It's as if they sense something in the air around him, a gravity that pulls at faith and fear alike. He knows every twist of these alleys, every statue that watches from the corners. The city itself feels alive, breathing with the weight of its history, from emperors to martyrs to saints. He says sometimes you can still feel the prayers that were whispered here hundreds of years ago, trapped in the stones. And if prayers can stay, so can other things. The Vatican calls it pastoral service. He calls it warfare. Tonight is one of those nights when the veil feels thin. The reports came hours ago. A family near the old district, hearing voices that weren't their own. He doesn't rush. Evil, he's learned, feeds on panic. He walks with the patience of someone who's met eternity and knows it can wait. As he passes a church gate, a group of nuns nod politely, unaware that the man before them has seen more of hell than any scripture could describe. He reaches the square, where tourists once laughed during the day. Now, it's almost empty, the light fading into bruised blue. Somewhere under the cobblestones are the catacombs, the city beneath the city, where early Christians prayed in fear and buried their dead in secret. He pauses for a moment, listening. To most people, it's just the hum of traffic and distant footsteps, but he hears more. The city speaks to him in echoes, in whispers rising through drains and cracks, like old sins resurfacing. He knows that whatever waits behind the door tonight is not the first, and it won't be the last. He adjusts his collar, breathes in the heavy air, and steps toward the unmarked building that looms ahead. No camera can film what happens inside. Not because it's forbidden, but because machines cannot capture faith or fear, only faces. The lock clicks, the door opens, and the city exhales one last time before the darkness takes its turn to breathe. It began in a quiet village on the edge of Rome, sometime in the late 1960s. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where children played in the fields until the church bells called them home. But one evening, A girl stopped answering when her mother called. When she finally came to the door, her face was pale, her eyes too still, and her voice, when she spoke, wasn't hers anymore. The family thought it was illness. The doctor thought it was nerves. But when the lights began to flicker with every word she said, someone whispered the one word no one wanted to hear: possession. The young priest who arrived was new, barely 30, his collar still stiff from training. He had studied the rituals, memorized the Latin, but no classroom could prepare him for what waited behind that door. The air inside the house was thick, heavy, like the walls were holding their breath. The girl sat on the floor, trembling, her hands clutching her rosary so tight the beads cut into her skin. When she looked up, her eyes changed. Not rolled, not wide, just changed, as if something ancient was watching through her. The priest's heart raced, but his voice stayed steady. He opened the Book of Rites and began to pray. The words were Latin, older than nations, sounds that once echoed through monasteries, before electricity, before noise, drowned out faith. The family knelt together, afraid to breathe. Then the temperature dropped. The candle flame bent sideways. It felt as if the room itself was exhaling centuries of memory. A voice came from the girl's mouth, but it wasn't hers. It spoke in perfect Latin, words no child could know. It laughed when the priest asked its name. He felt something push against his chest, invisible but solid, as if the air had turned to stone. He raised the crucifix higher and continued the rite. "Deliver us," he said, his voice shaking now, "from every evil." The voice answered, mocking, repeating his prayer backward. For a moment, doubt clawed at him. What if this wasn't real? What if he was only feeding her madness? But then he saw her body lift from the floor, slow, silent, her feet no longer touching the ground. It was only for a second, but it was enough. He finished the prayer, every word louder than the one before, until the room cracked with sound. The girl screamed, and the sound broke like glass. Then it was quiet. The candle steadied. The air warmed. She fell into her mother's arms, sobbing, whispering his name, the first word she'd spoken in days. The priest closed the book and wiped his forehead, realizing that this, his very first case, would follow him for the rest of his life. That night, as he walked back toward the church, the bells rang for evening mass, and he looked up at the sky, wondering how many times he would have to fight this same darkness again. The church has always been built like a fortress, not just of stone, but of meaning. Every lock, every gate, every key has a purpose. People think those keys only open doors, but the old priests say they also keep things closed, things that were never meant to be set free. To understand why the church keeps keys, you have to think of it as a house standing at the edge of two worlds. One world made of light, prayers, and faith, and another filled with everything that was thrown out of heaven but never found its way to hell. The walls between those worlds are thin, and the church was built to hold them in place. It isn't just faith that keeps the balance, it's design. The shape of cathedrals, the arches, the way light hits the altar at sunrise, all of it is intentional, a kind of architecture that traps what doesn't belong. In ancient times, priests studied demonology like engineers studied bridges. They believed evil moved like wind, slipping through cracks and words and memories. So they built locks, not with metal, but with rituals, prayers, and sacred geometry. Every sacrament, every blessing, was a seal placed over an opening. The keys they carried were more than symbols of power. They were promises to keep the doors shut. Inside the Vatican, deep beneath the marble halls, tourists walk above. There are rooms with no windows. That's where the oldest keys are kept, not just physical ones, but texts, scrolls, and incantations written in languages that no one speaks anymore. The Chief Exorcist once said, "The church doesn't fight evil, it contains it. That's why it needs locks." Because if the wrong word, or the wrong rite, is used in the wrong place, Something ancient might remember how to get in. The church learned this the hard way. There are stories, old and quiet, of ceremonies that went wrong, doors that were opened instead of sealed. The priests who survived were said to have heard voices for the rest of their lives. So they rewrote the rites, built thicker walls, and buried what they couldn't destroy. That's also why exorcists are trained to be careful with every word they speak. Latin isn't just a dead language. It's a key that fits specific locks. Each phrase has a sound that pushes back against something unseen. When said correctly, the air changes. When said wrong, the air listens. The church may seem obsessed with control, but control is what keeps the walls from cracking. Faith alone doesn't hold the line, knowledge does. And that's why the chief exorcist keeps his own set of keys, some made of brass, others made of words. Because he knows there are doors in this world that never should have been built, and the only thing worse than forgetting the key is forgetting why it was made in the first place. No one really knows how many exorcisms he performed. The stories say more than 100,000, but the official records barely admit a few hundred. Somewhere between those numbers lies the truth, a truth the church never wrote down because it doesn't belong on paper. They called it pastoral care, a soft phrase for something that felt more like trench warfare for the soul. The chief exorcist kept no trophies, no notes, only a worn ledger filled with dates and initials. To outsiders it looked harmless, but each line carried a memory, each mark a night when the veil between worlds thinned and he stood in the middle holding the line. He once said, "Counting didn't matter, because evil never stops to rest. It doesn't keep score, it waits." Still, people tried to count for him. Journalists, students, skeptics, each searching for proof of the impossible. They found church logs, mentions in parish diaries, even letters written by other priests who witnessed what they couldn't explain. Yet the numbers never matched. Some were erased, others rewritten. Some cases filed under mental illness, some under miracle. It was as if the church itself didn't want to see the full total, as if writing it down might give it weight, might make the darkness too real. But among the older priests, there was an understanding. When someone said he had passed 100,000 rites, no one argued. They only nodded and crossed themselves. Because deep down, they knew that every exorcism isn't just one act. It's many. A prayer, a command, a battle, sometimes over days, sometimes over years. Each one fragments into countless smaller fights, each word a weapon, each silence a test. The chief exorcist once told a young seminarian that he never counted people, only victories. And even those he didn't celebrate, he said the moment you start keeping score, pride walks in, and pride was the first sin to fall. The Vatican, however, loved numbers. They needed to quantify everything, so they asked him once, in a formal letter, to clarify his total for the archives. He replied, with only one line, "How do you measure mercy?" After that, they stopped asking. Some believe the higher number, the one whispered in corners, wasn't exaggeration at all, because many of his rites were quiet, unrecorded, performed in small homes, hospitals, prisons, places where paperwork couldn't follow. He went wherever he was called, never asking for recognition, never waiting for approval. His hands aged faster than his face. His eyes grew tired but never dim. The numbers meant nothing to him, but to the people who met him, each case meant everything. Counting them was impossible, not because they were too many, but because each one carried the weight of a life restored, a mind reclaimed, a light kept burning. That kind of work can't be tallied. It can only be remembered, whispered like a prayer, one that ends not in amen, but in silence. The chief exorcist used to say that every battle he fought required tools, both simple and sacred. None of them looked special to the untrained eye, but each one carried centuries of power, shaped by faith and fear. The stole, for instance, was more than a strip of cloth. It was the symbol of authority, purple for penance, draped across his shoulders like a command to the unseen. He would kiss it before each ritual, not as superstition but as a promise that he would not face the darkness alone. Then there was the oil, kept in a small glass vial wrapped in linen. To outsiders, it smelled faintly of olives and incense, but when the rite began, it became something else. The oil marked the boundary between what belonged to God and what didn't. He would trace it on foreheads, doors, even over the ground where something invisible had passed. Next came the salt, ordinary on the surface, but once blessed it was no longer a seasoning. It was a weapon. He scattered it at thresholds, windowsills, even under beds where fear had settled like dust. He said, "Salt doesn't destroy evil. It just reminds it that it doesn't belong here." Then there were relics, pieces of saints' bones or splinters of crosses kept in small silver cases. He never used them to scare. He used them to strengthen. The presence of holiness was like a pulse, steadying the heart of the room. Every relic, he said, was a story, a memory of someone who had already faced darkness and won. The final and most dangerous tool was his voice. The prayers he spoke were in Latin, not because the language itself was magical, but because it was old enough to remember when the world still trembled at sacred words. The liturgy, when spoken correctly, didn't sound loud. It sounded deep, like thunder trapped in the walls. Sometimes he would whisper it so softly that even the person beside him couldn't hear, and yet the air would shift, the temperature drop, the lights waver. He said that was when the prayer reached where sound couldn't go. He carried a crucifix too, plain and worn from use. The wood darkened over the years, where his fingers gripped it during battles no camera could ever capture. Cameras, he believed, could only see what light reveals. Faith, however, could see what light forgets. That's why he never allowed recordings of his rites. To photograph an exorcism, he said, was to misunderstand it. It wasn't a spectacle. It was surgery for the soul. Every item he used was a scalpel, every prayer a stitch. And when the ritual was over, he would gather his tools in silence, wipe the oil from his hands, and bow his head. Because even though he had seen things that would paralyze most hearts, he never forgot what these objects truly were. Not weapons for destruction, but instruments of restoration. Proof that even in war, faith can still heal. There is a room inside the Vatican that few have ever entered, and those who have never speak about it in daylight. It is small, silent, and entirely without mirrors. The Chief Exorcist called it the safest place in Rome and the most dangerous. The walls are bare stone, cold to the touch, and the only light comes from a single candle on a wooden table. No icons, no paintings, no glass. He said, reflections attract attention. That's why the mirrors are gone. In that room, there are no names spoken, only prayers. Every exorcist has a place like this, a sanctuary that doubles as a battleground. It's where they confront what the world denies exists. The church pretends the room is just storage, an unused chamber from another century. But the priests who know its purpose understand it's the heart of their hidden war. When he enters, he leaves his name outside. In this space, titles mean nothing. What matters is faith and focus. Because once the rite begins, there is no room for doubt, and doubt is the first door evil walks through. He learned early that mirrors are more than glass. They are invitations. Reflections don't just show what is there, they can show what wants to be seen. In older cases, he said, faces would appear where they shouldn't, shapes that smiled when no one did. So the mirrors were removed, every one of them, until the room could no longer echo what did not belong. The silence here is heavy, almost alive. You can hear your heartbeat louder than your breath. He always began by touching the wall with his fingertips, grounding himself in the stone, reminding himself what was real. Then he'd place the candle on the table, light it, and open his book. The words came slow, deliberate, ancient. Sometimes the air would move even though there was no wind. Sometimes the flame bent sideways, as if bowing to something unseen. There were nights when the person brought into the room would begin to speak in voices layered over one another, old and young, soft and venomous, all at once. In those moments, the priest's voice had to stay steady. The rite demanded balance, a rhythm between command and compassion. He said the hardest part wasn't facing what was inside them. It was facing the reflection of his own fear, the one that didn't need a mirror to exist. When the ritual ended, the candle would burn lower, the air would settle, and silence would return. He would stay until the last ember went out, waiting for the room to breathe again. Then he would unlock the door and step back into the light. He never looked behind him, not because he was afraid, but because he believed that once you've faced the darkness in a room with no mirrors, the only reflection that should matter is the one inside your own soul. The Vatican Library is not all marble halls and golden ceilings. Deep beneath it, there are rooms where the air smells like old paper and dust, and the silence feels too heavy to belong to this world. That is where the archivist works, an elderly man with eyes like candlelight behind thick glasses. He moves slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of folders that haven't been opened in decades. When the Chief Exorcist visits, no one records his arrival. He signs no logbook. He simply nods, and the archivist understands. From a locked drawer, the old man slides out a single folder. Its corners are worn, its label nearly rubbed away. Inside are typewritten notes with lines blacked out, words that vanish under thick ink. Each case has a number, a date, a name replaced by initials. At the bottom of every page is the same signature, his. The archivist whispers, almost apologetically, that some files are missing. Others were sealed by order of the congregation in the 1970s. He says it like a confession. Beside the folder, he places a small box filled with audio reels. The tapes have no names, only dates and strange descriptions. One says, March 17th, breathing. Another reads simply, crying. He threads one into the old machine and presses play. The sound that fills the room is faint, a whisper layered under static. Then, a voice, his voice, reciting the beginning of the rite. After a few seconds, another voice interrupts, deeper, distorted, almost human, but not quite. It laughs. Then, the tape cuts to silence. The archivist turns it off, his hand trembling slightly. He says some tapes end mid-sentence, others never start at all. No one knows why. The chief exorcist listens without expression. He has heard worse. He asks if there are any more, and the old man hesitates before opening another drawer. Inside are hundreds more reels, unmarked, their metal spools dull with age. He says some of them were recovered from churches after fires, others from monasteries that no longer exist. They are fragments of battles fought in forgotten corners of the world. When he reaches for one, labelled only with a cross, the archivist stops him. That one, he says quietly, is not meant to be played again. The priest nods and closes the drawer. Before leaving, he looks through the small window that faces the city. The sun is setting over Rome, turning the rooftops gold. For a moment, the light touches the shelves, illuminating the dust like tiny spirits rising from the pages. He says softly that faith has a memory, even when the church tries to forget. The archivist smiles sadly and replies that memory is its own kind of haunting. As he walks away, the door closes with a slow echo, and somewhere behind him, the reels whisper as if something inside them is still trying to finish its sentence. Science and faith have always walked the same road, just on opposite sides. For most of his life, the chief exorcist lived in the narrow space between them, where belief ends and explanation fails. He worked with doctors, psychologists, and neurologists, people who carried microscopes instead of crosses, who studied the brain but never the soul. At first, they dismissed him. They said possession was a misunderstanding of mental illness, an old superstition that medicine had already buried. He didn't argue. He simply invited them to watch. One of them, a psychiatrist from Milan, came to disprove him. The patient was a young woman who had been through every form of therapy. Nothing worked. The moment the priest entered the room, the girl's body stiffened and her eyes rolled back as she began to speak in a deep male voice. The doctor stepped forward, demanding to know what drug she'd been given, what trick was being played. But there were no drugs, no tricks, just a voice that called the doctor by name and whispered the one secret he'd never told anyone. He froze, his face pale. After the ritual, he left without a word. Months later, he sent a letter to the priest that ended with a single line, "I owe you an apology." The neurologist was different. She refused to use the word soul, even after seeing things she couldn't measure. She examined patients under scanners, recorded brainwaves during trances, and tried to map possession like a sickness. But her graphs told lies. During one case, she watched as brain activity spiked in ways no human body should survive, yet the patient spoke calmly in Latin. When the exorcism ended, the scans returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. She stared at the results for hours, unwilling to admit that maybe what she saw wasn't just electrical. She stopped working with him after that, though she never spoke against him either. He understood. Science likes patterns, and what he faced had none. Over the years, more doctors came. Some left as skeptics, others stayed as believers, but all of them reached the same invisible border, the line where data stopped and dread began. That line was his home. He often said that science explains the body, but evil aims for the will. The will is the bridge between what we are and what we choose to be. And when that bridge breaks, something else crosses. Medicine can't repair that, only faith can. Yet he never hated science. He said it was another form of searching for truth, one that often met him halfway. Late in life, when asked what he thought of modern psychiatry, he smiled and said, "I am grateful for every doctor who tries to heal the mind. But sometimes the wound isn't in the mind. It's in the silence behind it, the place no instrument can reach." The call came from a small village outside Rome, a place where the streets were still lined with olive trees and time moved slower than anywhere else. The priest arrived just before sunset, the air thick with the smell of soil and smoke. The boy sat in the corner of a stone house, his hands tied loosely with a rosary that had long since snapped. He couldn't have been more than 14. His father said it began one night after Mass, when the boy started mumbling in his sleep, words that made no sense. At first, they thought it was fever. Then, the words grew clearer. Latin. Not the Latin of textbooks or Mass, but the kind used in prayers older than memory. The boy had never studied it. He barely spoke Italian. When the priest entered, the boy stopped muttering and smiled in a way no child should. The room went still. The first words he spoke were not his own. They were a hymn, one the priest recognized instantly, though not from any church he knew. It was a version of a sacred chant used in Rome before the year 500, something scholars had only reconstructed from fragments. The boy recited it perfectly. Then, without pause, he repeated it backwards. The priest felt the blood drain from his hands. Latin spoken in reverse does not sound human. It becomes something sharp, like metal grinding against bone. When the priest began the rite, the boy's voice changed again, shifting between tones, sometimes mocking, sometimes pleading, always aware. It quoted lines from scripture with perfect accuracy, even passages that had been removed centuries ago. When the priest commanded it to name itself, the boy laughed and said, "You already know me. You wrote my name." The candles flickered violently, and the scent of iron filled the air. For a moment, it felt like the entire house was breathing. The priest kept reading, his voice steady even as the boy's body began to tremble. Then the words stopped. Silence, long and heavy. The boy looked at him and whispered in flawless Latin, "Your faith is older than your church." Then he collapsed. When he woke, his eyes were his own again. He remembered nothing. The priest told the family to rest and burned the ropes that night. He returned to the Vatican carrying a single question he never wrote down. How could a child speak a language buried for 1,000 years? The theologians said possession borrows what the host cannot know, using it as proof of power. But deep down, he wondered if the boy hadn't been speaking from memory, not his own, but something older, something that remembered before books were written, something that still speaks through the cracks of time. It began as an attempt to bring logic into mystery. A mathematician from Florence, fascinated by the Chief Exorcist's records, asked permission to study his case files. The priest agreed on one condition: no names, no locations, only numbers. Over weeks, the mathematician charted every documented exorcism by decade. He expected randomness, a scatter of events that made no pattern. What he found instead was a curve. It rose and fell in rhythm with history itself, every spike aligned with disaster. There was a surge during the Second World War, another during the influenza pandemic, and strange smaller peaks that matched moments of moral panic, like the rise of cults or the spread of new technology. It was as if something invisible followed human suffering, moving wherever fear thickened the air. The mathematician presented the graph to the priest, expecting disbelief, but the old man simply nodded. He said evil is opportunistic, like smoke finding cracks in a wall. When faith weakens, when nations fight, when people feel lost, the doors open wider than they should. The mathematician frowned, arguing that correlation is not causation, that maybe trauma makes people imagine demons where there are none. The priest smiled and replied that imagination is the oldest doorway of all. Together they examined the data again. Between the years 1960 and 1970, there was another sharp rise, one that didn't match war or plague. It puzzled them until the mathematician noticed what those years shared: a global loss of belief, the questioning of every institution, the death of trust. The priest said that when the world stops believing in light, the shadows grow stronger. The mathematician tried to model that too, but belief doesn't fit on a graph. What disturbed him most were the gaps, stretches of time when the records went silent, whole years missing from the Vatican logs. He asked if the cases had stopped. The priest shook his head. They had simply gone unrecorded, hidden under phrases like pastoral care or spiritual aid. He said the church sometimes buries what it cannot explain. The mathematician ran the numbers again, adjusting for lost data, and the curve grew sharper, more alive, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath history. It terrified him. He asked if the priest thought the pattern meant evil was evolving. The answer came quietly. Evil does not evolve, he said. It waits. When people grow tired of miracles, it walks through what they leave unguarded. Years later, the mathematician published a paper about the psychology of mass fear. He never mentioned the priest or the files. But in his private journal, he wrote a single line that no one else ever saw. The equation works, but only if you believe the numbers aren't numbers at all. In Rome, night is never truly quiet. The city hums softly beneath its ancient stones, like a heartbeat that refuses to rest. Somewhere between the bells of midnight and the first stirrings of dawn, a phone begins to ring in a small apartment behind the Vatican walls. 3 rings mean urgent, 4 mean bring water and a relic, 5 mean call no one. The Chief Exorcist always knows which it will be before he even lifts the receiver. Sleep, for him, is a temporary truce, a fragile treaty that the darkness never signs. He answers with a voice that sounds both awake and ancient, as if he has been waiting for the call all his life. Sometimes it's a young priest on the other end, trembling, unsure whether what he saw was psychological or supernatural. Sometimes it's a nun from a hospital ward, where a patient refuses to be sedated because something inside her keeps screaming in languages no one speaks anymore. And sometimes it's silence, just breathing, heavy, uneven, like someone listening from a great distance. Those are the calls that last the longest. The Vatican has an unspoken network, a quiet chain of contact that only a few ever learn. It stretches through churches, hospitals, orphanages, and homes where the curtains are drawn tight. When something happens, something medicine can't treat and reason can't name, the call eventually reaches him. He doesn't write the addresses down. He knows them by memory, like stations on an invisible cross. The old rotary phone sits beside his bed, worn smooth by years of use. Its cord is tangled, its tone soft but final. The room around it is simple: a wooden crucifix, a bottle of holy water, a stack of case notes, and a candle that has burned so low it's become part of the dish that holds it. When the phone rings 5 times, he doesn't hesitate. He grabs his coat, his kit, and a small metal box of relics that clink faintly when he moves. Outside, Rome sleeps under a blanket of fog. The streets glisten from recent rain, and the air smells of stone and incense. He walks quickly but never runs. To run is to show fear, and fear is an invitation. The priests who assist him call these nights the thin hours, the space when the world's guard is down. The Chief Exorcist once said that evil doesn't work on a schedule, but it respects patterns. It prefers silence, shadows, and people who think they are alone. By the time dawn creeps over the Tiber River, he will have returned, exhausted but calm, his hands smelling faintly of oil and smoke. He'll pour a glass of water, sit beside the phone, and wait, because in this city of saints and ruins, where every street hides a story and every bell rings for both the living and the dead, he knows the next call is never far away. It happened during the winter of 1987, in a convent outside Florence. The case had already dragged on for days. The woman in the iron bed was thin, her hands wrapped in linen to stop her from clawing at her own skin. Her voice, when she spoke, didn't sound human. It shifted, rising and falling, mocking in one moment and growling the next. The Chief Exorcist had faced hundreds like it before, but this one was different. The air itself seemed to resist the prayers, every word bouncing back like an echo trapped in stone. He continued anyway, his Latin steady, the crucifix raised. The thing inside her spat, laughed, and spoke in tongues. None of it mattered until it stopped mid-insult and said his name, his real name, the one almost no one knew. Then it whispered something else, something that froze him. It described a night from his childhood, the exact words his mother had said as she died, words he had never repeated to anyone. He dropped the book. For a moment, the room felt like it was collapsing inward, every sound pulling into that one impossible sentence. The assistants thought it was a trick, that someone had fed information to the possessed woman, but he knew better. The truth, not the blasphemy, was what terrified him. Evil doesn't need to lie when the truth hurts more. He forced himself to keep reading, but the rhythm faltered. The voice laughed again, this time softly, like it was proud. Between curses, it began naming other secrets. Confessions he'd heard decades earlier. Each time, he tightened his grip on the crucifix, repeating the prayer louder until his voice drowned out the mocking. Finally, after hours that felt like years, the woman went still. The room cooled. A single tear rolled down her cheek as her breathing steadied. When she woke, she remembered nothing. He told her it was over, but deep down, he knew something had changed. That night, back in his quarters, he sat alone by candlelight, staring at his hands. They shook as he tried to write his report. Instead of facts, he wrote one line: "It told the truth." He never explained what that meant, not even to his fellow priests. In later years, he would say that the devil's most dangerous weapon isn't deception, it's knowledge. When it tells the truth, it does so to bind, to remind you of what you wish you'd forgotten. The next day, he returned to work as if nothing had happened, but from then on, every time a voice in a new case began to speak, he braced not for the lies, but for the truths waiting underneath them. Because sometimes what you fear most isn't what evil hides, it's what it remembers. Failure was not a word the Chief Exorcist used often. In his long career, he had seen things no one should see, and survived rooms that seemed to breathe against him. But there was one night he could never speak of without his voice falling quiet. It happened in 1972, in a small orphanage just beyond Naples. The call came from a nun who had worked with him before, her message brief and trembling. A girl had begun screaming the names of saints in reverse, her skin cold even under blankets, her eyes reflecting the flame of candles like mirrors of glass. He arrived before dawn, the corridors dim and echoing with the sound of wind through broken shutters. The child sat at the far end of the infirmary, her hair tangled, her hands bound in linen. She did not look afraid, she looked aware. The exorcism began the same way as always: prayers, the sign of the cross, the recitation of ancient words meant to separate light from shadow. At first, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped, and the girl's voice changed. It spoke clearly, calmly, like someone older than time. It said his name, the way no one else did, and told him to stop. The others in the room saw nothing, but he saw the flicker in her eyes, something watching through her. He continued the rite, louder now, commanding it to depart. The girl laughed, and for a moment he thought he saw her reflection behind her, a second image, faint but real, smiling when she did not. He pressed on, his words shaking the air, his hands gripping the crucifix so tightly the metal bit into his palm. But the laughter grew stronger, spreading like smoke. Then the candles went out. In the darkness, someone whispered, "Not her, not him, something else." When the light returned, the girl was staring directly at him, her face blank, her lips still. The rite ended hours later, unfinished. She stood, her movements steady, polite even. She thanked him in a voice that wasn't hers, and then she walked away. The nuns thought she had been healed, but he knew better. Her eyes followed him until the door closed. He said nothing, only packed his things and left. For days after, he couldn't pray. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw hers, calm and unblinking. When the church asked for his report, he wrote 3 words. The room won. He never explained. Years later, when a student asked him what failure meant in his line of work, he looked away and said softly, "Failure is a door that stays open." It haunted him for the rest of his life, not because he lost, but because he didn't know what had stepped through that door, or where it had gone. Some nights, long after he retired, he would wake suddenly, feeling watched, and whisper the old prayers under his breath, as if sealing a crack only he could still see. He was not the kind of priest people imagined when they thought of miracles. He wore glasses too thick for his face, and always carried a notebook stained with coffee rings. They called him the Jesuit, with a microscope, because he studied the supernatural the way scientists study cells. He didn't chase mystery, he dissected it. To him, every claim of possession was data, every reaction measurable. He catalogued odours, room temperatures, tremors in the voice, even heart rates. He charted every strange event with precision, convinced that faith and reason could walk the same road if both stayed honest. When the Chief Exorcist first met him, they disagreed instantly. The Jesuit believed most possessions were psychological, the mind turning on itself under pressure. The priest, older and quieter, said that was true for many, but not for all. To prove it, he invited the Jesuit to witness a rite. It was not a performance, it was a test. The Jesuit arrived with instruments, a small recorder, a thermometer, and a notebook, ready to capture anomalies. The room was a modest one, a convent chapel dimly lit by candles. The woman sitting in the chair looked fragile, her face calm, her eyes hollow. The rite began slowly, Latin words filling the air like steady waves. The Jesuit took notes, marking temperature changes, recording the sound of her breathing. Everything followed patterns until it didn't. The woman began to recite in Aramaic, a language she could not possibly know. Her voice deepened and split into 2 tones, overlapping but distinct. The recorder froze. The thermometer cracked. The Jesuit watched as her pulse remained steady, even while her body trembled as if caught between two realities. He tried to step closer, but she turned her head sharply and said his name. Not just his name, but the name of his mother, the street he grew up on, and the prayer she used to say before bed. He stopped moving. No one else in the room could have known those details. The chief exorcist kept praying, his voice unbroken, commanding whatever spoke through her to depart. After a final scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the woman went limp. Silence filled the room. The Jesuit sat down, his hands shaking. Later, he reviewed the recorder, but the tape was blank, except for a faint whisper at the end that repeated his own name. He never explained it to anyone. For months, he avoided the chief exorcist, refusing interviews and research invitations. When they finally met again, he simply said, "I believe now, but not in the way you think." The priest smiled knowingly and replied, "That's how it begins." From that day on, the Jesuit kept his microscope closed. He no longer needed to measure what he already knew. Some truths, he realized, do not fit in notebooks. They live in the space between faith and fear, where numbers fail and silence begins to speak. Before he became the chief exorcist, he was a young seminarian, barely out of his 20s, still learning how to stand steady when the unseen pushed back. His mentor was a man everyone called Father Leone, though among the priests he was known simply as the saint, not because he performed miracles, but because he carried peace like a lantern. His hands looked carved from wood, his knuckles thick with age and prayer. His humor was sharp enough to break tension, but kind enough to never wound. He would joke that demons feared him not for his holiness, but because he refused to lose his temper. The young priest followed him everywhere, from city chapels to rural parishes, watching as Leone handled cases that others avoided. He never raised his voice during rites. He never looked afraid. He said, "Calmness confuses the enemy." One evening, after a long day of prayer and confession, they sat in a small courtyard surrounded by olive trees. The young man asked him what the most dangerous part of exorcism was. He expected Leone to say possession, or the violence, or the sleepless nights. Instead, the old priest smiled and said, "Pride dressed as piety." He explained that when a man believes he alone can command darkness, he has already lost. The rite is not a display of power. It's surrender in the name of something higher. "We are instruments, not heroes," Leone said, tapping his chest with one hand. "The devil loves a proud priest more than a sinful one." Those words stayed with him forever. During one of their last missions together, a young woman was brought to them, speaking in tongues and convulsing so violently that 3 men could barely hold her down. The young priest wanted to take charge, to prove himself ready. He began the prayers too quickly, his voice loud, almost defiant. The room seemed to darken. Leone stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're praying to be heard," he whispered, "not to be obeyed." Then he continued the rite in a low, steady tone. Within minutes, the woman went still, her breathing normal again. The young priest felt shame burn his chest. Afterward, Leone said nothing for a long time. Finally, he turned and said, "Never fight to prove faith. Fight to protect it." Years later, when the young priest took Leone's place as the Vatican's exorcist, he still remembered the smell of olive oil and old paper from those nights. He remembered the weight of silence between prayers, and whenever pride began to creep into his heart, whenever people called him a saint or a savior, he would think of Leone's wrinkled smile and his warning that even holiness can cast a shadow if the light behind it is self-made. The saint who taught him never sought recognition, he only sought peace. And that, he realized, was the real mark of power, the kind that doesn't shine but steadies even when the darkness trembles. There is a corridor inside the Vatican that tourists never see. It does not appear on any map or floor plan, and even most priests do not know where it leads. It is long, narrow, and dimly lit, its air cooler than the rest of the building, smelling faintly of wax and stone. At the end of that passage stands a plain wooden door. No ornament, no symbol, just a lock that shines from use. Behind it lies the ledger room, a place that holds the written record of every Vatican exorcism ever approved. Stamped dates, initials, and terse outcomes fill the shelves like gravestones of forgotten battles. Each book is bound in black leather, each page a record of confrontation between light and shadow. The Chief Exorcist had permission to enter, though he never came lightly. The room was never truly silent. Even with no one inside, the air hummed, as if the weight of so many names pressed against it. He would stand there for hours, tracing the spines of old ledgers, some so faded the ink had turned grey. Each entry began the same way: location, subject, duration, or result. Some ended in peace, others ended in blank space. What unsettled him most were the pages where the writing stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply disappeared. He once noticed a mark, a thin rectangle on one of the oldest ledgers, darker than the page around it. A page had been removed, its absence more visible than anything else. He ran his fingers over the outline, feeling the indentation of words no longer there. When he asked the archivist about it, the old man looked uneasy and said it had been missing since the early 1900s. The entry, whatever it was, had been erased not only from paper but from permission. No one was allowed to speak of it. The Chief Exorcist left the room that day with a strange heaviness in his chest, as if the missing page followed him out. That night he dreamed of a voice whispering from between shelves, not angry, not evil, just forgotten. Over the years he returned to that room many times, always stopping at that same shelf, always staring at the shadow of the missing page. He began to notice other absences too, entire years with fewer entries, months without reports. The Vatican called it reorganization. He called it silence. The more he read, the more he understood that not every exorcism ends with victory, and not every truth fits into Scripture. Some things are locked away not to protect people from evil, but to protect belief from doubt. Before he left the position for good, he placed his own ledger on the table, filled with thousands of initials, each one a life reclaimed. But at the back, he left one page blank. When asked why, he smiled faintly and said, "Because one day, someone will come looking for what's missing." Then he closed the door behind him, and the corridor swallowed the sound like it had been waiting for it all along. The case began in the spring of 1991, in a small apartment near the Tiber River. The woman's neighbours called the police after hearing voices at all hours of the night. 3 voices, they said, all coming from the same person. When the authorities arrived, they found her sitting calmly at her table, surrounded by mirrors covered with bedsheets. She told them she had locked something inside her reflection. They brought her to the hospital, but every test came back clean. No drugs, no head trauma, no disorder that science could name. Eventually, the church was called. The chief exorcist visited her under the quiet of night. The moment he entered the room, the air shifted. She greeted him politely, but her tone carried something off, a cadence too measured. As he began to speak with her, her voice changed. It wasn't just deeper, it was doubled, like someone else was answering through her mouth. Then, moments later, a third voice emerged, lighter, faster, mocking the first 2. Each one spoke as if it owned her, each claiming to be the master of the other. He had seen possession before, but never division like this. It was as though her soul had been cut into pieces, each one pretending to be whole. He realized quickly that arguing would solve nothing. Instead, he listened. The first voice called itself the Protector. The second claimed to be punishment. The third laughed and said both were liars. The priest began to treat it like a game of chess, moving carefully, forcing the voices to speak to one another instead of to him. He asked the first, what it feared. It said the second. He asked the second what it desired. It said to silence the third. Then he asked the third what it wanted, and it said, only truth. The moment it spoke that word, the woman's face twisted, and the air grew heavy. The priest pressed forward, praying softly, invoking the name of Christ, not as command, but as light. The three voices began to argue, shouting over each other until the sound became unbearable. He kept his voice steady, his words flowing over them like water. The woman's body convulsed, her hands gripping the chair so tightly the wood cracked. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. She slumped forward, breathing shallow, whispering a single phrase over and over, I am one. The exorcist waited, letting the silence settle before finishing the prayer. When she finally opened her eyes, they were calm, wet with tears, and her own once again. The mirrors in the room, once covered, now reflected only her face, pale but peaceful. She didn't remember the voices or the days she had lost. When asked why she had covered the mirrors, she said she couldn't stand seeing herself divided. The priest nodded and told her softly that mirrors don't show truth, they show fragments. And sometimes the hardest exorcism is stitching the pieces back into one. It was the year 2003 when a small documentary crew received rare permission from the Vatican to film a real exorcism. The Chief Exorcist agreed on one condition, that the cameras would stop if he asked. The crew consisted of 3 people, a director, a sound engineer, and a cameraman who swore he didn't believe in anything he couldn't touch. They set up their equipment inside a plain room on the outskirts of Rome, a place where the walls smelled of incense and damp stone. The woman they were there to film sat in a chair by the window, her wrists bound loosely with cloth. She looked calm, almost too calm. The crew checked the lighting, rolled the tape, and nodded to the priest to begin. What happened next was not what they expected. The air changed. The temperature dropped sharply, enough that their breath fogged in front of them. The sound engineer adjusted his levels, confused, because even though the room was silent, the meters spiked as if thunder were rolling somewhere unseen. The priest began the rite, his voice low and steady. The woman's eyes opened wide. The director whispered for the cameraman to zoom in. Through the lens, her face flickered for a second, as if the image had stuttered. Then the entire screen went white. The cameraman pulled back, panicked, but she was still there, unmoving. He checked the recorder. It was still rolling. The priest kept praying, and that was when they noticed the crucifix on the wall. Drops of moisture glistened on the metal surface, running down like sweat. Every cross in the room did the same. The cameraman tried to focus on one, but the image blurred each time, like the lens refused to capture it. The sound engineer listened to the headphones and heard something beneath the priest's voice. A whisper that wasn't echo, but something layered, speaking almost in rhythm with the prayers. He tore the headphones off, shaking. The director ordered him to keep filming. Hours passed. The woman screamed once, then went still. The priest finished the prayer and signaled that it was done. The woman blinked and began to cry softly. The crew exhaled, relieved, until the priest turned toward them and said quietly, "You can turn those off now." They packed their equipment in silence and left before sunrise. Back in the studio, when they played the footage, there was nothing. No voices, no faces, not even the priest. Just static, wind, and faint breathing. The director accused the cameraman of failure, but he swore he had checked everything twice. The Vatican labelled the tape as malfunction and locked it away. Years later, the cameraman stopped working altogether. He said that whenever he turned on a camera, he could see a flash of that room in the lens reflection just for a second. As for the priest, he never spoke of it again. He simply said that some truths refuse to be recorded because the moment they are seen, they stop being believed. No one knew the exact number until the Vatican clerk mentioned it in passing. 100,000 recorded rites. The chief exorcist paused when he heard it, unsure whether to laugh or pray. For the church, it was a milestone. For him, it was just another day marked by silence. There were no ceremonies, no interviews, no letters of recognition. Only a tired man returning to his room after another battle that no one would ever fully understand. He placed his case on the desk, opened the window, and let the cool night air slip in. The city outside was quiet, a living cathedral of shadows and streetlights. He moved to the small basin in the corner, turned on the faucet, and began to wash his hands. The water ran clear at first, tracing the lines of his skin, the grooves worn deep from decades of holding crosses and books. Then it darkened, not with blood, but with the faint dust of candle soot and old oil, reminders of the countless times he had touched what others feared. The water swirled in slow circles before slipping down the drain. He kept washing, not because he felt unclean, but because it helped him think. Every face he had seen passed through his mind, every voice that had begged, screamed, or whispered for release. 100,000. It didn't feel real. He remembered the first, a trembling girl in a stone room, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out the prayers. He remembered the middle ones, blurred together into a rhythm of faith and fatigue. He remembered the ones that didn't end well, the eyes that never turned back to human. The water turned cooler as he let it run, the metal basin fogging with steam before the chill crept in. He watched the reflection tremble in the surface, distorted and faint. The church called him a warrior, but he never believed in that word. Warriors fight to win. He fought to endure. He once told a young priest that every exorcism leaves a mark, not on the possessed, but on the one performing the rite. You carry their fear, their pain, their darkness. And the worst part is that you never know how much of it stays with you. The faucet squeaked as he turned it off. The last drops fell, clear again, like the water had finally forgiven him. He dried his hands slowly, staring at the drain as if it could answer him. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll midnight. He sat on the edge of the bed and whispered a prayer, not from any book, just words he made up on the spot. It wasn't for protection, it was for peace. Outside, Rome slept under its ancient sky, unaware that one of its oldest soldiers had just passed a number no human should ever reach. The basin gleamed faintly in the dark, the water still, the silence holy. He once told a fellow priest that exorcism was never meant to be a battle. It was an act of restoration. Most people, he said, think of it as subtraction, as if evil is something you tear out. But it isn't. Evil is absence, a missing piece of something that was once whole. When you cast it out, you aren't destroying it. You're returning what's left to its original shape. That was his private theory, one he rarely shared except with those who would listen long enough to understand. He compared it to rescuing a page from a burned library, fragile, half gone, but still legible if you hold it carefully to the light. You don't fight darkness, he said. You return a sentence to light. He believed that every human being carries a text written by something divine, and that possession is when part of that text is rewritten by despair. The priest's job is to restore the original words, not by force, but by memory. He said this once while standing in the ruins of an old Roman church built over an even older temple. The marble floor still bore carvings from centuries before Christ, names of forgotten gods smoothed by time. He brushed the dust away from one inscription and said, "Rome remembers Alexandria." When asked what he meant, he explained that long before the Vatican, before cathedrals or saints, there were scholars in Alexandria who believed knowledge itself was sacred, that to understand creation was to pray. They built their libraries like temples, filled with books that connected the stars to the soul. When the fire came, those pages turned to ash. But truth doesn't burn. It hides in the memory of those who seek it again. That, he believed, was what exorcism really was, a memory being rewritten. The demons, he said, were not fallen angels with wings or horns. They were erasures, voids in the text of creation, feeding on what people forget about themselves. Every person he helped was not a vessel for darkness, but a broken manuscript waiting to be restored. That was why he studied languages, history, even music. He believed that every prayer, no matter how old, was part of the same song trying to remember its melody. The church preferred simpler explanations, good and evil, sin and salvation. But he always saw the work as something older than religion, a continuation of that first spark that separated light from the void. Late at night, he would sit by candlelight, reading fragments of ancient texts, tracing words from the Hermetica and the Psalms with the same reverence. He once said that when he looked into the eyes of the possessed, he didn't see corruption. He saw a library on fire, and every prayer he spoke was another bucket of water against the flames. Rome, he said, remembers Alexandria because both were built on the belief that light is knowledge, and that to lose it is to lose ourselves. The letter was found years later, folded neatly between the pages of his prayer book. It had no envelope, no date, just a line at the top that read, "For the one who comes after me." It was never signed, never sealed, and never sent. But those who read it said it felt like a voice speaking across time. The handwriting was steady, the ink faded from age and sweat. The first line was a warning. Never hate the afflicted. He wrote that evil often hides behind suffering, and that the possessed are not the enemy, but the battlefield. Hatred, he said, makes you blind to the person inside. Once you stop seeing the human being, you have already lost the war. He reminded his successor that pity and pride are equally dangerous, that compassion without strength turns into weakness, and strength without mercy becomes cruelty. The next line was sharper. Never bargain with spectacle. He had seen too many young priests mistake drama for faith. He warned that exorcism is not performance, and that the moment you seek to impress an audience, you invite the wrong kind of attention. Evil loves to be admired, even in fear. It feeds on eyes, on cameras, on witnesses. He wrote that the sacred should remain unseen, because the moment you turn a prayer into proof, it stops being prayer. The third line was underlined twice. Never speak the ancient names unless you mean them. He said there are words older than language, sounds that do not belong to any alphabet. Some priests use them as weapons, but he called them keys. Keys that open doors both ways. He warned that to speak them without faith is to open a door you cannot close. Between these lessons were fragments of his own reflections. He wrote that after a lifetime of hearing voices that were not his own, the hardest part was learning to recognize silence again. He admitted that some nights he dreamed of the faces he could not save. He said he had come to understand that the goal was never to win, only to witness, to stand between what is breaking and what can still be healed. Toward the end of the letter, his words grew softer, almost like prayer. You will know you are called to this work, not by what you see, but by what you endure. If you ever stop feeling fear, walk away, because fear keeps you honest. He closed with a simple benediction, written in small, uneven script. May the doors you open lead only to light. May the ones you close stay closed forever. Beneath it, there was a space where a signature should have been, but instead there was a single smudge, as if he had tried to write his name and changed his mind. Perhaps he knew that the letter was never meant for one person. Perhaps it was meant for anyone brave enough to listen. It was a quiet night in the Vatican, colder than usual for spring. The Chief Exorcist sat alone in his small cell, a single candle burning beside an open Bible. The flame bent slightly each time the wind sighed through the old window frame. He had been writing notes, not official records, but reflections, thoughts meant only for himself. Then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the empty corridor outside his door. He froze, listening. The monastery was locked for the night. No one should have been there. The sound stopped right at his door. Then came a scent, faint but unmistakable, iron and violets, like blood mixed with flowers left too long on an altar. He knew that smell. He whispered a prayer under his breath, not one of fear, but of recognition. Whoever had come was not unknown to him. He didn't turn as the latch clicked open. The door creaked slightly, and the candle flickered as if bowing. A shadow stretched across the wall, tall and still. He spoke first, his voice calm. "You've taken your time." There was no reply, only the soft sound of air shifting like a breath that didn't belong to lungs. He continued, "I knew you would come, but not here. Not tonight." The shadow moved closer. The air grew denser, not heavy, but charged, as if the room itself was waiting for a decision. Then a voice came, quiet and smooth. "You've called me many times. You said my name, even when you didn't mean to." He closed his book slowly, folding his hands. "I called no one," he said. "I only spoke truth." The voice chuckled, a sound that carried no warmth. "Truth," it said, "is how I find the faithful." For a moment, neither moved. It was a game of stillness, of patience, a chessboard of silence and breath. "You lost one once," the voice said. "The girl with the blue eyes." His fingers tightened. He remembered her. He remembered everyone he couldn't save. "You have no power here," he said softly. The voice moved closer, almost behind him now. "Power? No. Memory, yes." The candle flared, the flame stretching higher, thin and white. "What do you want?" he asked finally. The voice paused. "Only what I've always wanted. Permission." The priest stood slowly, the candlelight shaking across the walls. "You'll never have it," he said. Then, in the same calm tone, he began to pray. The words filled the room like air filling a lung. The scent of iron faded, the shadow shrank, and the temperature shifted back to normal. When it was over, he turned, and the room was empty. The door was closed. He sat back down, his pulse steady again, though his hands trembled slightly. He dipped his fingers in the bowl of holy water and crossed himself. Then he whispered, "Next time, I won't wait for you to knock." The candle flickered one last time before settling. Somewhere in the corridor, the echo of footsteps began to fade, one by one, until all that was left was the silence of victory or warning. He couldn't tell which. There are no medals for what he did. No portraits, no plaques, no songs. Only a ledger filled with dates, initials, and quiet victories that no one will ever see. But even that ledger is incomplete. It cannot hold the laughter that returned to homes once haunted, the smell of food cooking again in kitchens that had gone silent, or the soft sound of a lullaby sung by a mother who thought she would never sing again. Numbers can measure actions, but not restoration. He knew that from the beginning. He used to say, the count was just the shadow the flame throws, never the light itself. The real work, the real miracle, was life returning to normal, the sacredness of ordinary days rebuilt one breath at a time. The world will never know how many lives he saved, and maybe that is how it should be. Faith, he believed, works best when it isn't witnessed. Rome still breathes around him, the same way it always has, ancient and patient. The bells still ring, the streets still glow gold at dusk, and pilgrims still walk past the Vatican without ever guessing that behind its walls a man spent half a century fighting for light. In the end, his hands grew frail, the fingers that once held the crucifix now trembling when they turned pages. He stopped keeping count. The ledger stayed on the table, the ink faded and uneven, as if even the paper had grown tired. He said that some prayers don't need to be written down. They keep themselves alive in the world through the people who were changed by them. When he spoke of evil, he no longer used the word fight. He called it remembrance. To remember the light when everything seems lost is an act of defiance. He believed that was what exorcism truly was. The stubborn belief that light belongs to us, even when it flickers. The night before he died, he sat by the open window and listened to the sound of Rome sleeping. He touched the keys that hung around his neck, the same ones he had carried since the 1970s, symbols of authority, but also of responsibility. He placed them on the wooden table beside his bed. The metal was cool, catching the faint glow of the candle nearby. He whispered a small prayer, not for himself, but for whoever would come after him. A simple plea that the next hands to hold those keys would remember that salvation isn't thunder or spectacle. It's the return of small things. A meal shared, a child's laughter. A morning where the air feels clean again. When the candle burned out, the room was still. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, and the city exhaled as if it knew. The door closed softly. The keys stayed where he left them, cooling in the dark, waiting for the next dawn, the next name, the next whisper of light.